Welcome, learners. My name is Mr. Pochilola once again. I represent BLACKSLIDES online. This is the platform where you learn the sciences, namely physics, chemistry, biology, agriculture, and mathematics. We meet now for a lesson on a Form 3 chemistry topic called testing for water. So we are going to explore the techniques, the experimental techniques involved in testing a substance for water. That's checking if a given substance contains water or if a given substance is water. Remember that in your chemistry lab, you have different chemicals that look like water. Not everything that looks clear is water. You can only confirm if a given liquid is water by using experimental techniques which are collectively called testing for water. If you are watching this video lesson on our YouTube channel, consider subscribing and hit the notification bell. This will help you every time we upload new material. You will get a notification. You may also consider the option of joining us in our main classroom by simply sending us a text message to the numbers shared here. Invite your friends, wherever they may be, to join us on this platform. So subscribe and hit the notification bell if you have not done so already. Welcome, learners. Without wasting your precious time, let's get down to the business of the day. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to define a chemical test for water. You should be able to identify the reagents used to test for the presence of water in a substance. You should be able to describe how anhydrous copper sulfate is used to test for water. Should be able to describe how cobalt chloride paper is used to test for water. You should as well be able to state the observations and conclusions for each test for water. It will be helpful for you also to write balanced word equations, balanced chemical equations related to the hydration of anhydrous copper sulfate. You should be able to distinguish between substances that contain water and those that do not, using the appropriate chemical tests. You should be able to perform simple experiments to test for the presence of water safely and accurately. So these are the areas that we would like to explore in this lesson. Welcome once again. This is BLACKSLIDES Online Secondary School. Consider subscribing to the channel. Invite your friends wherever they are. You can like and comment to this video lesson. You can also share to your friends the link to this video so that they can also join and learn on this YouTube channel. If you are learning in our main classroom, consider doing all the assigned work and remember to share your responses with me by sending them to the number that I gave earlier. But if you are watching on our YouTube channel, simply give your responses as comments in the comments section below, and also let us know where you are watching this video from. Welcome, learners. Welcome to objective number 1, which is to define a chemical test for water. What does it mean to test for water? First of all, what is a chemical test? We shall understand a chemical test as a procedure that uses a chemical substance, which is called a reagent, to identify whether a particular substance is present or not. That's called a chemical test. So the test produces a visible change, such as color change, if the substance is present. That's what we mean by chemical test. So in testing for water, it means we use a certain kind of reagent. A reagent is simply a chemical which is used to test for the presence of another. So we are going to use two reagents in this case independently, namely cobalt chloride, anhydrous cobalt chloride, and the anhydrous copper sulphate. These are the two reagents that can be used to identify whether a particular substance is present or not. In this case, whether water is present or not present. So the test produces a visible change, such as a color change, if the substance is present. So what is a chemical test for water then? So a chemical test for water is simply a test used to determine whether a substance contains water by using suitable chemical reagents. The two common reagents used are anhydrous copper sulphate, which is powder, white powder, and the cobalt chloride, paper, which is blue. So why should you test for water anyway? Why do we have to test for water? It is useful to test a substance for the presence of water in order to identify whether a substance contains water or not. We can also use the test for water to distinguish dry substances from wet substances, meaning those that contain moisture and those which don't contain moisture. You can use this test to distinguish the two. We shall use the test to identify products formed during chemical reactions, whether one of the products is water or something else. It also helps you to analyze unknown substances in the lab, especially liquids that are clear, that look as clear as water, so you can analyze them to tell whether they contain water or not. So take note that the two reagents that can be used independently to tell whether the substance is water or not are anhydrous copper sulphate. Anhydrous means without water. So anhydrous copper sulfate is white, and the anhydrous cobalt chloride is blue. But you can also use the anhydrous cobalt chloride powder as an alternative to using paper. I've seen a question quite a lot that says, name 2 reagents that can be used to detect water, to test for water. So the answers to such a question are anhydrous copper sulfate and anhydrous cobalt chloride. Welcome, learners. So for your MSCE exams, we are saying a chemical test for water is a laboratory test that uses chemical reagents to determine whether water is present in a substance or not. For example, if a colorless liquid is suspected to be water, it can be tested using an anhydrous copper sulfate or cobalt chloride paper. If the reagent changes color, it indicates that water is present. So in summary, from this objective, we are saying a chemical test identifies the substance using a reagent. And the chemical test for water detects the presence of water in a substance. The main reagents for testing for water are anhydrous copper sulfate and anhydrous cobalt chloride paper. So we are going to look at each test one after another. I want you to pay attention to this description, to this lesson, and identify the key examinable areas for this part. Welcome, learners. So from what we have said, tell me what is a chemical test. What is a chemical test? Define a chemical test for water. Name the 2 reagents commonly used to test for water. Why is it important to test for the presence of water? So we've covered this in the previous objective. And I expect you to answer these questions and share your responses with me to the numbers that I shared earlier on. Welcome to the second objective, which is to identify the reagents used to test for the presence of water. Of course, in the previous objective, we have already found out that the 2 reagents used to test for the presence of water are anhydrous copper sulfate and the anhydrous cobalt chloride paper. So what is a reagent? A reagent is a chemical substance used to test for the presence of another substance by producing a characteristic change. The change can be change in color, it can be production of gas, a certain gas, which is called effervescence, or otherwise. So reagents used to test for water: cobalt chloride, anhydrous cobalt chloride, and anhydrous copper sulfate, as we have already seen. So for anhydrous copper sulfate, the word anhydrous, and means without, anhydrous means without water. So anhydrous copper sulfate basically is a white powder. It doesn't contain water by nature. It is called anhydrous simply because it contains no water. Anhydrous means without water. So when water is present, it changes from white to blue. So you'd observe the white powder turning blue. That indicates that water is present. So we are saying copper sulfate, which is white, anhydrous copper sulfate, which is white, plus water will give you hydrated copper sulfate, which is blue. So the fact that upon adding water to anhydrous copper sulfate, which is white, it changes to blue. It's an indication that water is present. The observation is that the white powder turns blue, and the conclusion is that water is present. If it doesn't change color from white to blue, it means that water is not present. So you should be able to write equations of this type: copper sulfate reacting with water to form hydrated copper sulfate. So anhydrous copper sulfate is CuSO4 plus H2O gives hydrated copper sulfate CuSO4 5H2O. This shows that 5 water molecules are bound to copper sulfate. Check that your formula is balanced. Your equation is fully balanced. Welcome, learners. For cobalt chloride paper, which is a different test for water, anhydrous cobalt chloride paper is blue when it's dry. When it comes into contact with water, it changes from blue to pink. So the observation is that the blue cobalt chloride paper turns pink, from blue to pink. The observation is turning to pink. The conclusion is that water is present. If the cobalt chloride remains blue after adding a liquid to it, then it means that the liquid in question is not water, it's something else. Welcome, learners. So in summary, we are saying that the two reagents that can be used to test for water are anhydrous copper sulfate and the anhydrous cobalt chloride paper. So the original color of anhydrous copper sulfate is white. When water is added to it, it changes to blue. The conclusion is that water is present. It also follows if the color doesn't change, if it remains white even after adding a liquid to it, it means that water is not present in such a chemical or substance. Cobalt chloride has original color of blue. When you add water to cobalt chloride, it changes from blue to pink. That's an indication that water is present in the substance. If the cobalt chloride remains blue, then it means that water is not present in the substance under test. So the key points to remember are that anhydrous copper sulfate changes from white to blue in the presence of water. This is a confirmatory test for water. Alright, so if the anhydrous copper sulfate, which is originally white, changes to blue, then you can conclude that the substance being tested is water. If the anhydrous copper sulfate remains white, then it means water is absent in such a substance. Cobalt chloride paper, which is originally blue, changes from blue to pink in the presence of water. If it stays blue even after adding some liquid to it, then it means the liquid is not water, it's something else. So both reagents are relatively reliable tests. Both reagents, in this case cobalt chloride and anhydrous copper sulfate, are reliable tests for detecting water. So what is a reagent? Name the two reagents used to test for water. What color change occurs when anhydrous copper sulfate comes into contact with water? What color change occurs when cobalt chloride paper comes into contact with water? Which reagent is white powder and which one is blue paper? Write down the answers and share with me. Welcome, learners. Welcome to the platform. Subscribe to the channel in case you have not done so already. Invite your friends, wherever they are, to join us on this platform. Help them to subscribe, hit the notification bell. It is going to help you to receive notifications every time we upload new material. Welcome to the third objective, which is to describe how anhydrous copper sulfate is used to test for water. Anhydrous copper sulfate is white powder originally, and it is commonly used to test for the presence of water in a substance. It is called anhydrous because it contains no water of crystallization. It doesn't contain water. So when water is added, it forms hydrated copper sulfate, which is blue. So the color changes from being white to blue. In order to carry out this test, you shall need anhydrous copper sulfate itself, which is white. You shall need a test substance, which is a liquid. It can also be a solid. You need a test tube, spatula. You need a dropper for liquids. So these are the materials you shall need to test for the presence of water in a substance. So you place a small amount of anhydrous copper sulfate into a clean dry test tube. This is the procedure you would carry out. Add a few drops of the liquid being tested, or place a small amount of solid sample into the powder. then observe any color change. So you observe that the white anhydrous copper sulfate turns blue. This is the observation you'll have. So if the white of powder turns blue, water is present in the substance. If there is no color change and it remains white, it means water is absent. So originally this is anhydrous copper sulfate. When water is added to it dropwise, there's a transition, the change from white to blue. This indicates that the liquid being added dropwise is water. If it's not water, let's say it's ethanol, the color will remain white. There will be no color change. Welcome, learners. So that's how we do test for the presence of water. So the observation is white anhydrous copper sulfate turns blue. This is what you'll see with your eyes. So if you see this happening, it means that water is present in the substance. This liquid being added is water. If there's no color change and it remains white, then water is absent. As a chemist or a chemistry student, you should be able to write down your observations in terms of equations. So we are saying copper sulfate, which is anhydrous, originally white, and water would turn it to a blue substance, which is hydrated copper sulfate. So anhydrous copper sulfate is CuSO4 plus 5 molecules of water would give us hydrated copper sulfate, which is blue. So originally this is white. When you add water to it, it turns blue. Copper sulfate, pentahydrate. You need to be careful when doing this experiment. Check that your apparatus are dry to avoid false results. So don't use test tubes that are wet or that were just washed. You may end up having false results. Make sure that your test tube, the spatula, and all that you're using is dry. Do not touch the hydrated copper sulfate with wet hands. Otherwise, a reaction like this will happen on your fingers. Use only small amounts of the test substance. Welcome, learners. So in summary, we are saying that the reagent used is anhydrous copper sulfate. The original color of anhydrous copper sulfate is white, but upon adding water, it turns to blue, meaning that water is present. So why is copper sulfate called anhydrous? Tell me, what is the original color of anhydrous copper sulfate? What color change shows that water is present? What conclusion is made if the powder remains white? Write the word equation for the reaction between anhydrous copper sulfate and water. These are your questions to answer and share with me. Let's look at the test. If you use cobalt chloride paper, That's what we're covering now in this objective. Describe how cobalt chloride paper is used to test for water. Cobalt chloride paper is another reagent used to test for the presence of water. The paper is blue when dry and changes to pink when it comes into contact with water. So you shall need apparatus such as cobalt chloride paper itself, the test liquid, it can be a liquid or gas, and only a dropper for liquids, and then a forceps. So the procedure involves placing a piece of blue cobalt chloride paper on a clean dry surface such as a table or bench or something. Add a drop of the liquid to the paper, or expose the paper to the gas or vapor being tested. Observe any color changes. If the liquid being tested is water, the blue cobalt chloride paper will change to pink. If the blue paper turns pink, it means that water is present. So this is cobalt chloride paper. So we are saying upon adding a liquid on it, if the liquid is water or contains water, the blue color will change to pink. So if the blue paper turns pink, water is present. It means this liquid in the dropper is water. If the paper remains blue, then water is absent. Welcome, learners. So why does the color change in both cases, especially with cobalt chloride? When cobalt chloride absorbs water, it becomes hydrated, causing the paper to change from blue to pink, indicating that water is present in the substance. Once again, some precautions. Use dry cobalt chloride paper, otherwise you'll get false results. Avoid touching the paper with wet fingers. It may also affect the results of your experiment. Store the paper in a dry container to prevent it from absorbing moisture from the air. Otherwise, the paper will already have turned pink before it is even used. This is BLACKSLIDES, your school where you learn the sciences, namely physics, chemistry, biology, agriculture, and mathematics. In case you'd like to join us in our main classroom, don't hesitate to send me a text to the numbers that I shared earlier on. So in summary, we are saying that when we are using cobalt chloride paper, the original color is blue. But upon adding water to it, it will change from blue to pink. That indicates that water is present. If the color remains blue, it means that water is absent. So the key points from this is that cobalt chloride paper is our reagent. Its original color is blue. If water is available or present, it turns to pink. The changing of color from blue to pink is an indication that water is present. Alright, so what is the original color of cobalt chloride paper? What color does it change to when water is present? What conclusion is made if the paper turns pink? Why should cobalt chloride paper be kept or stored in a dry container? State 1 precaution when using cobalt chloride paper. Welcome, learners. My name is Mr. Pochlola, your teacher on this platform. Feel free to text me, and if in case your questions, I'll be very excited to attend to your questions regarding what we are teaching here. Objective number 5, state the observation and conclusions for each test for water. Remember, so far we are saying there are 2 tests that can be carried out. One uses anhydrous copper sulfate, the other one uses cobalt chloride paper. So when testing for water, it is important to record the observation. Observations are what you see. And the conclusion. The conclusion is what the observation means. So an observation provides evidence that helps you to decide whether water is present or not. What you see happening with your eyes gives you proof that helps you to decide whether water is present or not present. So using anhydrous copper sulfate, the reagent once again is anhydrous copper sulfate, which is white. The observation is the white powder changes to blue. That's what you'll see with your eyes. The conclusion is water is present. If the white powder does not change to blue, then it means water is absent. So an observation provides evidence that helps you to decide whether there is water or not. Using cobalt chloride paper, cobalt chloride paper in this case is our reagent. It's blue in color. The observation is that the blue color changes to pink, which helps you to conclude that water is present. Water will be present if and only if the blue paper changes to pink. If the paper remains blue, it means the water is absent in the substance. So in summary, what we are saying, when we use anhydrous copper sulfate as a reagent, you'd observe the white powder turning blue, which means water is present. But when you use anhydrous copper, if the anhydrous copper sulfate remains white, then water is absent. Using cobalt chloride as a reagent, it will change from blue to pink, indicating that water is present. But if water is not present in the test substance, the cobalt chloride remains blue, indicating that water is absent. Welcome, learners. So the key points to note from this is that always record both the observation and the conclusion. The color change indicates the presence of water. No color change indicates the absence of water. What observation shows that water is present when using anhydrous copper sulfate? What observation shows that water is present when using cobalt chloride paper? What conclusion is made if anhydrous copper sulfate remains white? And what conclusion is made if cobalt chloride paper remains blue? Why is it important to record both the observation and the conclusion using an experiment? So these are your questions to answer and share with me. I'll be glad to read your questions, to read your answers, and give feedback. In your MSCE exams, you face this question, which says describe an experiment that can be done to test if a given substance contains water using anhydrous copper sulfate. So this is the format of the answer you should give. It's called a descriptive essay. So you begin by saying collect anhydrous copper sulfate, which is white powder, a test tube, a spatula, a dropper, and a substance to be tested. Ensure the test tube and all apparatus are clean and dry. Place small amounts of white anhydrous copper sulfate into the dry test tube. Add a few drops of the liquid sample or a small amount of the solid sample to the reagent. Gently shake or stir the contents. Observe whether the white anhydrous copper sulfate changes to blue. Record your observations. And then you write the chemical equation that takes place of the reaction. So we have anhydrous copper sulfate plus water giving hydrated copper sulfate. Remember also to write this in symbols. So copper sulfate is CuSO4 plus 5H2O giving CuSO4.5H2O. Be careful here about the conclusion. If the white anhydrous copper sulfate turns blue, then the substance contains water. If it remains white, then the substance does not contain water. So this is how you conclude. Do not say it will be observed that anhydrous copper sulfate turns blue. No, don't say that. You have to be a condition. You have to use if condition. So if this, then that. If the white anhydrous copper sulfate turns blue, then the substance contains water. If it does not change color, then it does not contain water. So this is the 10 marks answer. Welcome, learners. So each point is 1 mark. Alternatively, you can also be asked to describe an experiment that can be done to test if a given substance contains water using anhydrous cobalt chloride. So collect blue cobalt chloride paper, forceps, a dropper, and the substance to be tested. Ensure that the cobalt chloride paper is dry and blue before use. Place the cobalt chloride paper on a clean, dry surface, or hold it with forceps. Add a few drops of the liquid sample, or expose the paper to the vapor of the substance being tested. Allow the paper to come into contact with the sample for a few seconds. Then observe whether this blue cobalt chloride paper changes color. Record the observations. Write the equation. We have anhydrous cobalt chloride plus water gives hydrated cobalt chloride. And then write the symbol equation. Cobalt chloride is COCl2. Be careful here. The O has to be a small letter for cobalt. Plus water gives us cobalt chloride and water. If the cobalt chloride paper turns pink, then the substance contains water. If it stays blue, then the substance does not contain water. So this is a descriptive question for cobalt chloride. Then as we come to the end of this lesson, I look forward to having the solutions to the questions I gave you. Let's meet again in a different lesson. Bye-bye for now.